Let's get started today talking. What I wanted to talk about today is a little bit about philanthropy. We've been bouncing around ideas about philanthropy, about things that we might do, right, in terms of using money to help better humanity and things like this. And people's ideas are all over the place. They bounce around quite quickly. I don't think that generally, culturally, we do a lot of very good thinking about this topic. I'm not going to propose, just to outline sort of my thoughts, I'm not going to propose, just say, here's how to do it. What I want to do is have several conversations that take different approaches and think them through. Like, what are the implications of thinking like this? What are the implications of thinking like that? I suspect the right answer is probably going to borrow bits of each, so this is just an exploration. So today I want to lay out one basic idea then for us to discuss and say, do we like this? What do we like about it? What don't we like about it? Something like that. Online we had talked about a bit about sort of expected annual contributions or something like that to think about what people might contribute. Like most things, we split kind of nicely and didn't come to any clear resolution. So we're good at that. So roughly, I think the idea would be to think that each member might contribute $60 a year, which is about $1 a meeting. So it's not a ton in that way. But that's a loose expectation. It gives us something to think about, the amount of money we might have something to do with. I like the idea of us getting together to discuss what to do with it, because one of the things that does is prompt us to think a little more carefully, right? Of course, you're going to make donations on your own with your own money in your own directions, right? But getting us together as a group, we have to then argue about it. We have to then think about it. We have to then discuss it. And I find a lot of times groups are better than individuals at weighing different things, at thinking of things that you might overlook, at resisting certain biases and things like that. So I think it might be helpful for us to have this conversation, to think carefully about how we might do this. All right. So what we're looking for are principles. Why do we need principles? What are those for? If we think about the religious rules that we're familiar with, that other churches might have, the tithing is a very common one, right? You're supposed to give 10%. The problem with a rule like that, without an account, without an explanation, of just saying this is the amount that we're supposed to give, is it can't answer any of the questions you might have. So let's think about that rule. You're supposed to give 10%. Well, what does that mean? Is it 10% of what you own? Is it 10% of your income? Those would be two different amounts, right? We already wanted to do that, to think about it in that way. Does it include just money that you make from work, or do stock dividends count, or unrealized capital gains, or all sorts of questions that sort of spew out that it doesn't really speak to. It also doesn't speak to what you should do with the money, right? Give it to the church. Well, then what do they do with it? What are their priorities? How do they decide where it goes and what you're supposed to do? Because it doesn't seem to have like an account, an explanation, a principle that would say, this is what we're trying to accomplish, because then we can come back and say, okay, now we can say how much you should give and where it should go and all of that kind of thing. So the principles help us deal with that. Now, the principles that get used out there, particularly by other churches, can have all sorts of problems. So a lot of times churches use charity for evangelical purposes. That is, the point of using their charity is to convert people, right? To bring them in, to get their name out there in some cases. That's something that they're trying to do. In other cases, it's really to make contact with people and so on. I think this is incredibly risky, and it's not clear that it qualifies as philanthropy. It's not obvious that it means to help people in ordinary ways. You're trying to provide them with a good that they don't necessarily recognize as good, like unless they want to convert, you're aiming at something that they don't necessarily want. And you're often doing it with the most vulnerable people. That is the people who need that aid, who need that kind of help, right? It's the reason that they're listening to you or discussing it with you, right? You're not providing this to the wealthier people who don't need that aid or something like that. So I think the sort of evangelistic goal, right, which some churches have with their charity, warps it. It seems to get away from something that we want. We've got to be careful in thinking about charity, and I think a lot of people do tend to work on their feelings, right? Things that get them feeling compassionate, that get them feeling like helping somebody, that they see a case in most situations, one person, one individual, one animal, one of these things, and they say, I have to help that one. We've got to be careful about that. That is subject to manipulation, right? Somebody can play off, right, that they're poorer than they need to be. They can make their case sound really sad, right, and ways to get it. That is subject to the bias of what's in front of you, right, ends up being the thing you pay the most attention to, when the bigger problems might be something you don't see easily, that isn't happening right in front of you and in your world. So principles would help us resist that kind of manipulation, right? To organize our feelings, to know when we should go with them and when we should resist them. We have to be careful because charity can do harm as well as good. Now, it can do harm in terms of unexpected effects, undermining sorts of connections that people may be able to have, longer-term support, things like that, but can also do harm in being dehumanizing. Right? When people get gifts in certain ways, when they're given to them in certain ways, it can make them feel lesser, right? They're unable to reciprocate, they're unable to contribute. It can do harm in that way as well. It can be degrading. So we've got to think carefully about the principles that we might want to use. We need something to guide us through, I think, these more complicated issues. So here's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with consequentialism. That's the name of this theory and this approach. Its most famous proponent is probably Peter Singer. If you want to look him up on the internet, you can find him in lots of different places, giving TED Talks and a number of things on this subject. People inspired by him have started calling themselves the effective altruists, right? So you might want to look that up as well. It's another option, right? This is a particular kind of approach. And it's particularly amenable to humanism. Right? So if we start with one simple idea, all humans matter, and all humans matter equally. It means that we should have impartial concern about all of those human beings. That is, we shouldn't value one human being more than another. We shouldn't say this one's more important than that one. All humans matter equally. Okay, good. So now we've got money. Now we're going to help. Now somebody's in trouble. Given the state of the world, there is a lot more people out there who need help than that we can help, right? Vastly more people out there who need help than we can help. Giving it to one person, addressing one cause, necessarily means not giving it to another person and not addressing another cause, right? There's necessarily conflicts if we're going to value all people equally. Okay, so how do we resolve these conflicts? The consequentialist approach says we want to look at the consequences and do the most good. Or another way to think about it. Look at the costs, look at the benefits, and make the donation to the area where you're going to get the most benefits, right, minus the costs. Maximize interest satisfaction. All right. So what might this mean? If you're thinking about, say, dealing with the homeless, I know this is one situation we can deal with. People who are homeless are in a bunch of different kinds of situations. Some people are what they call short-term homeless. They've just recently lost a home. And usually they have friends or family or some other resources available that aren't immediately available to them but can be accessed. There are other people who they label the long-term homeless, who've been homeless for months, for years. The variety of problems in that area. If you have one bed, right, you can give it to one of these two people. How should you decide this? Well, this consequentialist principle say, go where it will do the most good. So what happens if you don't give it to the short-term homeless person? Most of the time what happens in those cases is they find some other way. They manage to find somebody else, and that within a week or so, they're not homeless anymore. They sleep in their car for a little bit, and they get it resolved. So it's bad, but it's not terrible. For the long-term homeless, though, you find much more difficulty in dealing with it. So right now, I know in terms of dealing with the homeless, the thought is prioritize the long-term homeless if we can get them into housing. The other cases are easier to handle, can often resolve themselves, and so on. And this would follow the simple principle of do the most good. You've got one bed, where should you give it? Well, where you can do the most good. Deal impartially between the two people. It's not that you prefer one to the other, it's that by giving it to this one, you can satisfy more interests, you can help somebody, right, more than if you give it to that one. It's a simple idea. Right? It makes sense. I think it's a way we often deal with our own money and our own time and all of these sorts of things, right? It's like we can invest it here or there. Well, where do you invest it? Where you get the best returns. So this is the same basic idea when it comes to charity. All right. Now, the idea is that we have a moral obligation to give our money where we do the most good. So the thought is you wouldn't be forced to, but that it is wrong, right, to give money where it will do less good. Why is that? Well, because you're letting somebody suffer, right, in a way that would be preventable. You're essentially causing or allowing more suffering, right, if you don't give where you're going to do the most good. All right, so what are some of the implications of taking this approach of maximizing interest satisfaction? Well, that's up in the air, right? Because it does depend on what, sort of research shows us. We're going to look and say, okay, which kinds of interventions make a difference, which kinds of interventions don't make a difference. Just a few that seem to come up consistently. One is if you want to do the most good, for the most part, we can do it in the poorest countries. Dollars in the United States don't go nearly as far as dollars will in some of the poorer countries around the world. Their needs are often much more basic, right? They don't have access to water. They don't have access to safe places to stay. Whereas even the poor in the United States, in most cases, have access to, say, clean water or something like that. So most of the time, this is going to mean prioritizing people who live in the poorest countries in the world, right, rather than the ones who are closer to us, nearer to us, more present to us. Other studies have shown some other interesting things. It is beneficial to help girls more than boys, if you're talking about looking to help younger people. If you pay to keep girls in school, it turns out that the families will tend to also keep their boys in school. But if you pay to keep just a child in school, they'll tend to put their oldest boy in school and essentially invest all their resources in the oldest boy. So if you sponsor girls, you tend to get more in that way. The greater gender equity you find actually seems to help build up these communities. And so this would say there is now a sort of bias of a kind, right? A preference for helping girls, but not because girls are more important or more valuable, but because the consequences of helping girls seems to be better overall, right, than the consequences, right, of prioritizing boys or not doing either. So there's a bit of an unusual response or a thing that comes up in that area. Some other things that come out of this. Donating cash has turned out to be very effective. Give Directly is the organization that tends to do this. More effective than donating stuff, right? So Heifer International, for example, is one organization that says they're going to give people cows or goats or chickens. They have chosen the stuff, right, that they think that the people need in one case or another. Give Directly just gives them the money instead. $1,000 was the amount they were using in their initial tests to do this sort of thing. But we can compare these two. We can look at these two. Money tends to be better because it's cheaper to provide. They're lower cost, like transporting it is easy. Giving it to people is easy. And they tend to know what they need to spend it on. Whether they want to get a motorcycle, whether they want to get the cases they were looking at, a metal roof. Thatch roofs are actually quite expensive to keep replacing, so you help them get a metal roof, and that's a long-term benefit. Or anything else, right? I mean, they know what's best for them in their situation, rather than you saying what you need is a goat or a chicken or something like this. So often, giving cash is beneficial. I want to say often. Small amounts of cash don't seem to have made much difference. People seem to get rid of that pretty quickly. Microloans that people were excited about for a while don't seem to make a long-term difference now. They're suspicious about those, where savings accounts might. So you've got all of those sorts of things that come up. Say, we're going to do the most good means we need to give in the most efficient way, the one with the least costs, right, to be able to get the benefits, to the people where we can make the biggest difference, both for them and for others, right? So there might be some key people that sort of affect the larger community. And that's going to tend to mean giving farther away. It's also going to tend to mean giving to causes that don't look very much like problems that we personally encounter. So there's a great organization, GiveWell, that has gone about rating charities by their effectiveness. The people that started this were hedge fund managers previously, so they really knew how to evaluate stocks and companies and all this kind of stuff. And they said, well, we don't do this with charities. So they turned their skills in the direction of charities to say, what are the ones that are the most effective, that need more funding, right? Where you can make the biggest difference. And if you want to go look at their website, you can see they are incredibly transparent about how they do this. They even have a wonderful little tab on the side about our mistakes, where they've listed all the sorts of errors they've made and how they've gone about trying to fix it. Because this is the point, is to do this sort of research. All right, if you look at the list of top charities, they are things that provide stuff like bed nets to prevent malaria, right? Not a problem we have here in Louisiana, the problem we used to have in Louisiana a long time ago, but not a problem we currently have. So it means you're not likely to know anybody who's had malaria. You're not likely to have a friend who's, whereas that's not true with, things like breast cancer and some other things like this. But it turns out it makes a big difference to be able to protect people from these things. And it can be done fairly cheaply. Those bed nets are fairly inexpensive. Deworming is another one that makes a big difference. Again, you probably don't know anybody that got intestinal worms around here. It's not a common thing given the way that our sanitation works. So you don't have that kind of personal connection, right, that your feelings might readily go towards. But it makes a big difference for those individuals in those communities to get that taken care of. One more implication of this that might be a little more controversial. Donating to the arts is therefore not charity, right? Millions of dollars being spent on things like operas or paintings, things like this are not terribly effective in comparison to bed nets and deworming, right? So that's a bit of a difference. Now, maybe you want to donate in that direction anyway. That's a possibility, but one thing you could say is it's not philanthropy, right? What you're not doing when you do that is the most good. What you're doing is entertaining yourself, entertaining other people, something like that, right? You're doing something else. But you're not doing the most good when you prioritize things of that kind, right, with these donations. All right, so I think that lays out the position pretty well. That is the consequentialist approach, the looking at philanthropy by trying to do the most good, right? And that's certainly some criteria that we could use, right, to think about what to do with our money. So with that, I will turn this off and we can talk, see what you think.